Crowds drifted toward the sanctuary of the fallen, a place where silence usually carried more weight than any speech. Yet in one corner of that gathering, silence lost the battle. Brandon Whitfield, 13 years old and fully fluent in the language of TikTok, heard only the algorithm whispering in his ear. It told him that stillness was boring, tradition was outdated, and nothing had value unless it could be turned into content. His parents stood nearby, orbiting their own distractions. Jonathan scrolled through stock portfolios with the devotion of a monk counting beads, while Vanessa checked social notifications with the intensity of a surgeon in the operating room. In theory, they had come as guardians. In practice, they were audience members in their own son's performance, the kind of guardianship that can be outsourced to a Wi-Fi signal. The memorial stillness tried to press into Brandon's world, but he interpreted it as dead air. Where others saw reverence, he saw an empty stage waiting for his entrance. The sentinels marched in crisp precision, their boots clicking against stone like metronomes of memory. Brandon raised his phone, framing them not as soldiers but as props. He was ready to produce another bite-sized clip for strangers who would forget his name the moment they swiped. Then came the bottle. A single plastic missile, launched with the casual arrogance of someone who has never been told no. It arced through the sunlight and splashed across the boots of Marcus Ellison, the African-American guard who carried not only his weapon but the weight of memory for generations. The bottle didn't just leave a stain. It left a silence, thick and immediate, that settled over the crowd like a collective downvote. Eyes widened. Veterans stiffened. Parents in the crowd pulled their children closer, as if shielding them from second-hand disrespect. And still, the Whitfields remained statues of detachment, as though discipline were a subscription service they had canceled years ago. Brandon checked his screen for reactions, forgetting that not every audience is online. This one was real, flesh and blood, and the looks they gave him weren't likes. They were the kind of judgment that algorithms can't monetize. In that moment, the sacred and the superficial collided. A place meant for remembrance was reduced to a backdrop for clout. A boy traded respect for views, while his parents traded responsibility for comfort. The crowd didn't need to shout. Its silence spoke louder than any trending sound. If you think respect is getting paywalled by clout, hit like and drop your city. The bottle had already done its damage, but Brandon saw only opportunity. His phone captured every second, the camera lens framing solemn ritual as if it were nothing more than background B-roll for a comedy skit. In his head, the soundtrack wasn't silence or reverence. It was a laugh track waiting for a punchline. Marcus Ellison kept his posture flawless, every muscle trained to remain unshaken. His sunglasses shielded his eyes, but behind them lived memory, not stone. He had marched through rain, through blistering heat, through nights where even the stars seemed to hold their breath. He wasn't a robot. He was a man carrying both discipline and loss. Yet in Brandon's worldview, dignity was simply material for ridicule. The boy narrated his own show, as if the march unfolding in front of him were just another clip in his endless feed. He moved his camera left, then right, eager to squeeze humor from what he called monotony. Around him, the crowd became a silent moderator, watching with growing disapproval. Veterans shifted in their shoes, the kind of shift that speaks of years of sacrifice and the refusal to see that sacrifice mocked. Jonathan and Vanessa, meanwhile, perfected their impression of parents on airplane mode. Jonathan refreshed his stock tracker again, while Vanessa scrolled her notifications, pausing only to adjust her sunglasses. Their son's behavior didn't pierce their bubble. After all, parenting in their household had long been an outsourced service, managed by screens and excuses. A murmur rolled through the crowd. It wasn't speech, but a chorus of hashtags whispered under breath. Parenting fail, respect overdue, algorithm made me do it. The soundless chant rose, not loud enough to break the ceremonial stillness, but loud enough to remind anyone listening that this moment was bigger than one child's arrogance. Marcus stood steady, his silence now transformed into something symbolic. He wasn't just a guard anymore. He was a living line drawn between honor and apathy, a figure forced to stand unflinching not only before a teenager's mockery, but before an entire culture's erosion of respect. Brandon smirked at his screen, convinced his bravery was trending. But his bravery existed only under the protective glow of Wi-Fi. Offline, his jokes landed differently. They landed in the heavy air of veterans' stares, in the quiet disappointment of strangers, in the stillness that no algorithm could erase. The confrontation was no longer between a boy and a soldier. It was between entitlement and memory, between clout and sacrifice. And in that battle, silence spoke the loudest. The rope barrier stood as a quiet line, a reminder that reverence has boundaries. For most, it was enough. They saw the rope as sacred punctuation, the final word in a sentence that said, "Here, you stop." But Brandon read it like every terms of service agreement he had ever scrolled through, skimmed, ignored, and dismissed, with a blind tap on accept. With one careless step, he crossed. It wasn't defiance of tradition in his mind. It was content creation. His sneakers touched forbidden ground, and his phone rose like an idol, the lens reflecting his grin. A sacred memorial was about to become the stage for a selfie. The crowd inhaled sharply. To parents with children, it looked like a cautionary tale. To veterans, it looked like the erosion of everything they had fought for. Respect wasn't just disappearing. It was being replaced by hashtags and ring lights. Marcus Ellison had held his composure through worse. He had ignored insults before, tuned out chatter, even endured people who thought silence was just an awkward pause. But now, a boy had stepped not just past a rope, but past the invisible line between ignorance and contempt. Something had to break, and it wasn't Marcus. With one precise motion, he extended his arm and struck. Not a wild swing, not an outburst. Simply the unflinching correction of a man who had guarded memory too long to let it be mocked. Brandon's phone flew from his hand, spinning through the sunlight before it hit the stone. The screen shattered, pixels bleeding across glass. The glow of constant validation finally silenced. The crowd froze. For a split second, the entire world seemed to hang in suspension, like a buffering video waiting to load. Then came the reaction, a ripple of gasps, a murmur of approval, a collective realization that the first real lesson had just been delivered. Some smiled faintly, savoring the irony. A boy who thought himself untouchable had just been touched by consequence. Others frowned, uneasy with the breach of protocol, worried that tradition itself had bent under pressure. But symbolism did not wait for consensus. The broken screen reflected the truth with brutal clarity. For once, Brandon was offline. His carefully curated persona had cracked in the glare of reality, and no filter could hide it. This was no longer about a prank or a clip. It was about the illusion of invincibility shattering against the weight of honor. In that moment, Marcus Ellison hadn't just struck a phone. He had struck through the myth that disrespect could always remain digital. The phone lay in fragments, but the silence stayed whole. That silence was soon pierced by the arrival of authority. Officer Regina Miles stepped forward, her uniform carrying a gravity the broken screen could never match. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her presence alone declared that lines had been crossed, and not just the rope barrier. Brandon stood stunned, clutching empty hands as if they might conjure a replacement device. His parents finally looked up from their digital sanctuaries, their faces contorted not with shame but with indignation. Jonathan's mind raced through calculations, not of respect owed, but of damages to be settled. Vanessa rehearsed apologies the way she rehearsed captions, polished, shallow, designed for optics. They leaned toward Officer Miles as if consequences were negotiable. Jonathan murmured about misunderstandings, Vanessa about immaturity, both circling the same solution: money. Their strategy was clear: swipe the credit card, erase the lesson, move on to the next brunch reservation. But Officer Miles was not a customer service rep. She was a living reminder that responsibility cannot be refunded. And as she opened her mouth to speak, another presence joined her, Colonel Angela Brooks. Her uniform bore more years of service. Her posture carried decades of weight. Where Officer Miles represented immediate authority, Brooks represented institutional memory, the kind that doesn't bend for excuses. The colonel's words didn't need embellishment. They cut through the parents' attempts like scissors through tissue. She explained, in the blunt language of truth, that this was not about a phone, nor about money, nor about optics. This was about respect. A child had desecrated it. Parents had enabled it. And society had tolerated it. The Whitfields stiffened, trapped in a courtroom where every spectator was the jury. Jonathan's wallet might as well have been invisible. Vanessa's carefully curated image shattered more completely than her son's phone. The crowd watched, and their silence became applause without clapping. No hashtags, no filters, just a collective recognition that authority, when rooted in principle, cannot be bought. Brandon squirmed under the gaze of veterans, officers, and strangers. For the first time, the algorithm in his head went quiet. In its place, something heavier took root, the realization that there were no premium plans for avoiding consequences. This wasn't a warning, it was a verdict. And the sentence was still to come. By the time Dr. Naomi Sinclair entered the scene, the damage was no longer just digital. A phone could be replaced overnight. But character? That took longer. Sinclair wasn't dressed in uniform, yet her presence carried its own authority. She had no stripes on her shoulder, only the weight of years spent untangling excuses disguised as personalities. Brandon sat across from her, arms folded, face tilted into the universal expression of teenage dismissal. He muttered that it was only a joke, a prank, content for the feed. He said the words like they were passwords to unlock sympathy. But Sinclair heard none of that. To her, Brandon was less a rebel and more a symptom, a walking case study in a generation raised by push notifications and algorithms that applauded every misstep as long as it drove engagement. She pointed out what everyone else had whispered, that his behavior wasn't born in a vacuum. Behind him stood parents who treated accountability like an outdated app. Deleted, forgotten, replaced with convenience. Jonathan and Vanessa listened with tight jaws, their silence saying more than any defense could. Naomi laid it out clearly. Respect wasn't just about soldiers at a memorial. It was about the foundation of society, a currency more valuable than likes, views, or dollars. And Brandon had squandered it. Not because he was evil, not because he was broken, but because no one had ever required him to earn it. His parents outsourced discipline to screens, hoping entertainment would double as guidance. But screens can only raise consumers, not citizens. The boy shifted uncomfortably, the armor of sarcasm cracking. The phrase, "I was joking," began to sound hollow even to him. The psychologist didn't berate, didn't scold. She simply held up a mirror polished with truth. In it, Brandon saw not only himself, but the reflection of a culture where boundaries collapsed under the weight of convenience. Naomi turned her gaze toward the parents. It was a verdict without theatrics. This was not just his failure, it was theirs. They wanted to buy him out of consequences, but they could not buy him out of emptiness. And until they faced that, no apology, no course, no punishment would matter. What began as one boy's foolish stunt was now diagnosed as something larger, a society that had confused freedom with license and parenting with passivity. Brandon was not the disease, he was the symptom, and now the treatment had to begin. The sentence was not prison or probation, it was something far less cinematic and far more humiliating to the ego. 4 weeks of community service at the Heritage Memorial Grounds. No hashtags, no filters, no curated angles. Just brooms, gloves, buckets, and hours of work that refused to trend. Brandon traded his phone for a rake. The first days looked like punishment. His sneakers scuffed along the paths as he dragged trash bags heavier than his pride. His fingers blistered beneath gloves that had nothing to do with gaming. He scrubbed headstones until his back ached, realizing too late that respect required more stamina than sarcasm ever did. Around him, veterans appeared, not as hecklers, but as living annotations to history. One leaned on a cane, pointing to names carved into marble. Another sat in a folding chair, missing a leg but not his clarity. They didn't give lectures. They gave fragments, a scar on an arm, a photo folded too many times, a silence so thick it said everything. Their presence turned Brandon's chores into lessons, each sweep of his broom brushing against memories too heavy for a phone screen. By week 3, sarcasm began to fail him. He could no longer joke about the stains on his jeans or the sweat dripping down his back. The work was unrelenting, but the stories were worse. They made his usual defense, mockery, sound cheap, like a laugh track played over a tragedy. The turning point came when he met Helen Ward, a nurse from the Korean War, her hands still trembling with the memory of holding boys as they died. She told her story not with bitterness but with a quiet steadiness that stripped away Brandon's last layer of indifference. To her, respect wasn't a rule. It was oxygen. Without it, communities suffocated. Even his parents weren't spared. As part of the judgment, they were ordered to attend courses on responsibility and memory. It was less about them learning and more about reminding them that parenting is not a subscription you can cancel when inconvenient. Jonathan sat in the back row, restless without his spreadsheets. Vanessa tapped her nails against the desk, as though waiting for an alert to distract her. Yet even they could not avoid the sting of watching veterans speak about sacrifice, while knowing they had failed to teach their own son its meaning. Brandon's chores ended each evening without applause. No claps, no comments, just sore muscles and the quiet realization that this, finally, was content worth keeping. The punishment did not arrive in the form of handcuffs or courtrooms. It arrived in the shape of a broom, a bucket, and 4 long weeks at the Heritage Memorial Grounds. No likes, no comments, no algorithm waiting to reward the effort. Just labor, silent and unsponsored. Brandon began with the posture of someone convinced that chores were beneath him. The rake dragged behind him like a sulking companion, his sneakers leaving careless streaks on paths built for solemn footsteps. On day 1, he muttered about how boring it all was. By day 3, boredom had given way to blisters. Sarcasm doesn't protect your hands when you're scrubbing headstones. Veterans watched, not with anger, but with the calm scrutiny of people who had seen worse than teenage arrogance. One leaned against a cane, showing him names on marble. Another wheeled past, the empty space where a leg should have been more eloquent than any lecture. Their stories arrived in fragments. A photograph kept in a wallet too long, a scar traced absent-mindedly, a silence held heavier than any speech. Brandon tried at first to roll his eyes, but silence is hard to dismiss when it carries more weight than words. By the second week, sarcasm began to run out of material. A sweat-soaked shirt and aching back are terrible props for comedy. He found himself working harder, not because he wanted to, but because something in him finally recognized that each stone had more meaning than his entire digital feed combined. And then came Helen Ward. Her voice was steady, her eyes clear despite her years. She spoke of holding boys as they died during the Korean War, of washing blood from her hands only to watch it return the next day. She didn't scold, she didn't dramatize, she simply described. And in her description, Brandon's last layer of ironic detachment peeled away. For the first time, his laughter felt cruel to himself. His parents were sentenced too, not with brooms, but with parenting courses. Jonathan counted the hours as lost productivity. Vanessa tapped her nails as if waiting for her phone to buzz. Yet even they could not escape the quiet humiliation of being told, by strangers and veterans alike, that raising a child is not a feature you can outsource. Brandon went home each night with sore arms, dirt under his nails, and something he had never carried before, a weight he couldn't post, share, or monetize. A lesson with no filter, no rewind, and no skip button. 4 weeks passed like a slow download, painful, unskippable, and packed with lessons no algorithm would ever recommend. By the time the closing ceremony arrived at the sanctuary of the fallen, Brandon was not the same boy who had crossed the rope with a smirk. His shoes were cleaner than his conscience had ever been, and his eyes, once glued to a screen, were now fixed on something larger. The crowd gathered again, but this time Brandon didn't see them as an audience. He saw them as witnesses. The guards marched in precision, every step echoing like punctuation in a sentence older than him. Marcus Ellison returned to duty, posture unbroken, steps as sharp as the first day. To strangers, it was the same ritual as always. To Brandon, it was an antivirus program running against his old cynicism. For the first time, he didn't reach for a phone. He simply watched. Each boot hitting stone carried a weight he could finally feel. Silence pressed down again, but this time he didn't interpret it as dead air. He heard it as memory. When the ceremony ended, Brandon was led into the guardroom. The same space where rules had been broken was now the stage for something harder than punishment: confession. Marcus stood there, no sunglasses, no ceremonial precision, just a man carrying dignity. Brandon stumbled through his apology. Not polished, not rehearsed, but real. He admitted he had mocked what he didn't understand, traded respect for clout, and insulted more than one man. He had insulted the fallen themselves. Marcus listened, silent, letting the weight of the words settle. Then, in a tone steady as stone, he spoke, not as a guard, but as a brother. He spoke of Darius, lost in combat, the brother whose memory marched beside him every day. When Brandon had thrown that bottle, it hadn't hit leather. It had hit legacy. The handshake that followed wasn't warm or drawn out. It was firm, brief, and more powerful than any viral clip. It was offline verification, the kind no platform could forge. Brandon walked out of that room different. The crowd didn't know the details, but they saw something had shifted. The boy who once craved attention now carried humility. The parents who once outsourced discipline now stood uncomfortably still, aware that respect could never be bought, only lived. The lesson was simple, but brutal. Phones can shatter and be replaced. Respect, once broken, requires work, humility, and memory to rebuild. If you believe society still needs that reset, hit like, subscribe, and share your city in the comments. And remember, this story is fictional. Any resemblance to real people is purely coincidental. Life moved on, as it always does, but Brandon Whitfield moved differently. His phone, once a weapon of distraction, now carried different content. He didn't chase views with pranks or disrespect. Instead, he began posting stories he heard during his weeks of service. Veterans with scars, families with folded flags, nurses with trembling hands. The audience that had once laughed at his arrogance now paused to listen. For the first time, his feed had substance. And strangely enough, people stayed. His parents, too, went through their own reset. Jonathan's spreadsheets still existed, but he no longer measured life in percentages alone. Vanessa's notifications still pinged, but she had learned that validation offline mattered more than any heart icon. Their mandatory parenting courses didn't just embarrass them, they exposed the truth. Raising a child is not a subscription service you can cancel when inconvenient. They began clumsily to show up, not with money, but with presence. Marcus Ellison remained at his post. His boots still struck stone with precision, his uniform still sharp, his silence still commanding. But now, to Brandon, each step Marcus took sounded louder than any algorithm, echoing with the memory of a brother gone too soon. Marcus didn't need applause. He didn't need followers. His march itself was testimony, a ritual stronger than clout, a subscription you couldn't unfollow. The sanctuary of the fallen continued to draw crowds, some coming for history, some for curiosity. Yet whispered through the gathering was a new story, of a boy who once mocked and a guard who once struck. A story not of punishment but of correction, not of humiliation but of growth. And here is the irony worth keeping. A broken phone refreshes overnight. A broken culture does not. It requires work, humility, and a hard reset. Brandon learned that lesson the expensive way, with the cost of pride and pixels. His parents learned it too, stripped of excuses, reminded that responsibility cannot be delegated. What remains is the question for us. In a world where disrespect spreads faster than honor, who holds the line? Who reminds the next generation that silence is sacred, not awkward? Was Marcus right to break protocol? Or was society already broken long before the bottle hit his boots? This story is fictional. Any resemblance to actual people or events is purely coincidental. If this made you reflect, even for a moment, hit like, subscribe, and check the other stories on this channel. Some lessons are heavier than glass and louder than clout, but they're the ones that can reset us all.
Don't you fall for the guessing patient? Don't you pass for that hard moment, love? Don't you fall for the guessing patient? Let them know where the deepest goes.